right. Welcome everybody to our Friday night edition of Coach's Corner. We're going to be having a great discussion tonight to follow up last week's discussion on the criteria for determining candidates for the Chivalry and their eligibility. And we're going to be discussing kingdom differences tonight. And we have a special guest, His Royal Highness Valrik from Caid is joining us tonight. So welcome. Of course, we have our normal coaches, Graf Ulrich, Her Royal Highness Rauokinn, Jarl Ailgheanan, Duke Eliahu from the Mid-Realm, and of course, His Royal Majesty Sean. So welcome tonight, everybody, and it's good to see you.
Hello.
Hi. Hey there.
Before we get started, just kind of a little house cleaning. Please feel free to throw up comments in the Facebook chat. We will be passing along questions. We'll do the best we can with answering everybody's question. Don't be shy. We'd love hearing what's on your mind, and we'll answer as best we can. So we'll pass these along to the coaches, but I guess with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, then hi, I'm Eli. I'm from the Mid-Realm, although I've lived in several kingdoms. And I just want to explain a little bit of the premise of what we're doing. We had an episode previously that really is sort of the first part of this, and that was how we each as individual knights evaluate candidates for elevation in the order, and what we think of and what processes we use. And this episode is about what the kingdom process is. And we have people from a lot of different kingdoms because every kingdom has developed over time its own process, and those processes change over time. A lot of times, for most people, most unbelts, the process of deliberation is completely opaque. It's not at all evident to people who are aspiring to the Order of Chivalry. It's not at all clear how that happens. And while we talked about our individual processes for doing that, we thought it would be worth explaining some of the kingdoms, the processes the kingdoms do. Now, we're not going to talk about every kingdom, and we're not going to explain everything in depth, but the idea is just to give you an inkling of some of the ways that the kingdoms differ and some of what goes on. So before we get started, does anybody else have a comment? Okay.
I think we're good. Yeah, go ahead and jump into it.
Okay, so I've been a knight in the Mid-Realm. I was knighted in the Mid-Realm in 1983, and have, as a duke, obviously been on the throne a couple of times. And back then, this is just by way of perspective. Back then, the Middle Kingdom comprised not only what it is now, but also what is now the Kingdom of Callantyr, the Kingdom of North Shield, and the Kingdom of Eldermere. It was enormous. And one of my esteemed predecessors started using written polls, because previous to that, there were designated chivalry meetings in different parts of the kingdom. But the chivalry at that time weren't able to really share information very easily with each other. Keep in mind, this was before the internet. So there wasn't really a lot of information sharing available. It was really cumbersome to do. It was done in meetings. But the crown thought that it was important that every member of the order have a voice, be able to express their voice, and particularly share their information about candidates in their region. And so the crown, this was King Talamar, instituted written polling. And the written poll was, at that point, as I recall, just a list and asking for information, for feedback, for opinions. Yes, elevate, no, wait, or abstain, because I don't have enough information. And it was clear that knights in one region had information about candidates and not about another region, and knights in that region had information about their candidates and so on. Well, eventually the written polling became pretty much expected. Even as the kingdom shrank in size, in geographic size, a written poll became expected and became regularized. And then it's done, before or at the beginning of a reign. It's done towards the end of a reign. There's also a website where a private area on a website where knights can offer their opinion and their counsel, and any comments about a particular candidate are scrubbed from that when that person is elevated, so they don't see what the discussion about them has been. And there's written polling, which is considered just advisory. It's not a vote, but it's numerical. There have been royalty who figured out numerical formula, so many positive votes versus negative versus how aware they were of a person versus lots of complicated math. There are others who say, well, we have a duty, the crown has a duty to consult, the order has a duty to advise. Once that those obligations have been met, the crown can make a decision, and it's the crown's responsibility to make a decision. That being said, most crowns understand that elevating a candidate against the wishes or the advice of the majority of the order is not good for the candidate. But that's really where it's been. There have been at times a watch list, and then someone's polled to get onto the watch list, the crown could just add people to the watch list, and then there's a vote list that people have to be moved up to, and then they're elevated from there. Sometimes it's a single list, sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's smaller. A lot depends on the particular crown that wants to do it. And that's really the process in the middle. The royalty have always, in my memory, taken more information, welcomed more information than just an up or down vote, but a really welcomed counsel, more information, more so the crown can make a better decision. There are still meetings, in-person meetings, when there are in-person events, and those happen to share information. A vote is less vote. A consensus of the order is less likely to be acted upon just based on a meeting. There's usually a written poll that follows it. And that's it. So next, let's see. Sean?
I've got something
Okay.
for you, Eli. So that process sounds very similar to the process that they use in the East Kingdom. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of similarities there as well, for much the same reasons. When the East Kingdom started off, it included what is now Atlantia, Drachenwald,
Ethelmark.
and Ethelmark, right? And so same kind of thing, large geographical areas, large population bases, spread out pretty good. And so they still use a similar polling system back there. I suspect Atlantia may use a similar system as well, being a product of the East Kingdom. But yeah, it's a watch list, candidate list, and polling up and down. And they do, I think most of it is online now, but they, for a long time, they did mail-in pollings, written pollings very much the same way. And they would do it probably like once or twice per reign, but they would certainly do it like right before a new crown steps up, so that crown has that polling, and they have that counsel from the order, so that they can make decisions on who they're going to elevate from there. And so yeah, those are some written polling ones. A lot of the Western kingdoms also have like watch list, candidate list sort of thing. And I wanted to kind of pitch this to His Highness Valrik to kind of kind of talk about how they do things a little bit in Kaid with that same kind of thing, where you get pulled onto the watch list, you get pulled onto the candidate list, and that sort of thing. So, Your Highness, would you like to cover some of that for us?
Sure. So in Kaid, we have a system where we have just a watch list and a candidate list, and what that means is the watch list is is kind of self-explanatory. I could say, hey, I want to put this guy on the watch list, all right, and it takes one other person to second it, say in a meeting, and then they get put on the watch list. And all that means is everyone pay attention to them. They usually have a sponsor. They usually, if they have a knight, the knight's there, and there's always another sponsor regional. And now that we have online stuff, we're trying to do like an online document where we at least show the guy's picture or his coat of arms. All right, so people can see if we're talking about Bob, this is what Bob looks like, this is where you see Bob. And then there'll be a vote to move up to the candidate list, right? And I could be wrong about this, but I think once again, it's just one person to vote, move to the candidate list, another person to second it, and then they get up onto the candidate list. And after that, then once someone's on the candidate list, then the attention starts to focus. Let's talk about Bob. Does he have all the PLQs? How's his fighting? And then from then we would vote on a candidate, right? A candidate, if I'm right, our system it takes 2/3. It could be 2/3 plus 1. I don't think it's 2/3 minus 1. It's right around there. Now this is, I believe in Kaid. Now I could be incorrect, but the king listens heavily to what the Shiv Knights Council says, but he is not obligated to either make a knight. If we say we want Bob and the king's like, I hate Bob's guts, that's, I'm pretty sure they've just gotten kicked, they just sort of get a 6-month reprieve or pause. Now for the king to put somebody who hasn't been ever considered, never been talked about, so on and so forth, that has not happened in a very long time. And there's our system in place sort of, the king, if I'm right, still has the ability to do that, but there would be a lot of political backlash, a lot of people, it would just be it just doesn't happen very often.
A lot of pushback.
There'd be a lot of pushback. There'd be a lot of, hey, let's have a conversation, and people pushing back on why Bob shouldn't be made a knight, even though the king, this is his buddy. We just haven't had that situation come up in a very, very long time. But we have this kind of semi-formal process. People don't jump the queue very often. Sometimes people go from watch list to candidate real fast because everyone's like, hey, we haven't been paying attention to this guy. He's hot, he's kind of not squired to anybody. People who are often sort of socially awkward or kind of quiet as a personality, they tend to kind of fall into the background. And so sometimes someone who's got all of his peer-like qualities, and one of us goes, hey, we got to pay attention to Bob. And then before you know it, like, oh my God, what have we been missing? We've been sort of dropping the ball here. And then you'll see someone just kind of rise out of relative obscurity and get knighted. And people are like, well, how'd that happen? It's like, well, realistically, Bob's been fighting for 5 years. He's got the skills, and he just doesn't run around and shake everyone's hand and talk to everybody. So that's sort of having things online. We vote online, but we definitely do a face-to-face. I've sent in a lot of absentee ballots just because of my work schedule in the past, but we do meet twice, sometimes 4 times a year. Depends upon the rain, depends upon where we go. We do a strange thing. We actually meet in garb. So I don't know if other Shiv councils do that, but we drive to some business center, then we all meet in garb, which is, I don't know.
Is that meeting going to be outside of an event? Because I think most of us.
Oh yeah, it's typically on a Sunday. So most events are Saturdays for Kaid because we're not an overnight kingdom, meaning we don't have like an overnight tourney.
Right.
So, but it's typically we meet outside of an event weekend. That's the ideal.
That's interesting because I think a lot of kingdoms just do that at an event that's already happening, and
we have been loathed, but it's because we do 1-day tourneys. We drive there and then you pack up and leave that same day. Trying to cram a Knights Council in is tough. Sometimes if they do that, they'll be like, listen, we're going to talk just about this 1 or 2 candidates or a problem guy, right? Also in this thing, we have a problem with someone who's being a jerk at practice, who's being a rhino, whatever it is. So sometimes things like that will happen, but a lot of people are loath to do that at events because in the past we have had some epic Shiv councils like 5 hours. And so now a lot of people have a PTSD from sitting there for 5 hours, and guys literally drinking so much they pass out in their chair as we constantly debate. This was a long time ago. This wasn't recently. This was, right after I got knighted, we had some sort of, so now there's a bunch of us who are like, I'm of the mindset, like if we're going to do a meeting at a war, we're standing, we ain't sitting. So we got to keep this to an hour and we got to carry on. So that's how Kai does it. It's formalized, but it's not kind of, like I say, someone can, you could come from relative obscurity if they have the skill set. We've had some guys who moved in Kingdom in the past, and they obviously had all their PLQs in place. They had just, military guys, a lot of military passed through Kaid and because of the bases. And we've had some people, because they have the fighting and everything else, we've had people sort of, there's been some sidebar complaints, why did Jack get knighted so quickly? It's like, well, Jack's been doing this 20 years and he can fight very well. Just because you haven't seen him at all the tourneys that you've been trying to go to, he definitely has those skill sets. And that's happened in the past where someone sort of goes to the candidate, to the watch, to the candidate, and they get knighted within, say, a year or two. But that's because they've been all over the SCA. There's rarely someone comes, at least in my memory, we haven't had, someone come from obscurity who hasn't been involved in the SCA, like sort of someone who does everything in 2 years. But we had some people from start to knighthood in 3 years, definitely. I know that's happened. But they usually follow the traditional process. They get squired, they hit the tourney circuit, they make some stuff, help set up some tents, so on and so forth.
Cool.
Does anybody have questions about sort of how we do things or commentary? Does it sound strange? I'm kind of looking for what we do. Does that sound that much different? Or I don't know.
Well, I think the one thing that's different is the vote and second, or nomination second, to move somebody onto the watch list and to move somebody from the watch to the vote list. It's not formalized in that way in the middle meeting. That in that way it's a little more formal in the middle, which is an odd thing to say about anything, given the Middle Kingdom. So that was one of the differences, I thought. Also, having the meeting, the middle has had chivalry retreats, which is a weekend gathering of the chivalry at a hotel where we'll all fight, and then at the end of the day, discuss candidates, discuss issues, and occasionally drink a beer or two, and have a pizza or 12. And and those have been very worthwhile in terms of getting the chivalry to really understand each other's point of view and talk to each other, rather than and to get along with each other and to behave as a single order. There was a question, I'll just interrupt here. There was a listener question based on what I said, if I'm understanding correctly, the original design of the Middle Kingdom, the chivalry would comment on candidates in their area. When did this change and why? I did not mean to imply, as apparently I did, that candidates would only, or chivalry would only comment on candidates in their area and not on others. The chivalry who traveled a lot would be able to comment knowledgeably on candidates from all over the kingdom when the kingdom was large. But as the kingdom was geographically large, and then the population grew, eventually there was enough activity in various regions, which is a precursor to becoming a principality and then kingdom, that having a responsibility to activity in their region meant chivalry members of the order would stay in their region and might be more well acquainted with candidates in their region than outside the region. They could still comment on everybody, and it was not a change. It was not that you could only comment on people in your area, but you were supposed to comment on people you knew. And so as the population grew, the travel became more regional and less kingdom-wide, because at one point there was an event or two on a weekend, and that's where everybody went. And then there ended up being many, many events per weekend because of the size of the kingdom. So I hope that clarifies things. How about Elnan? Are we moving on to you?
I think we are.
Okay.
So just a little bit about my experiences. I've been fortunate enough to reign in Meridies and then more recently in Aidenvelt. But I've also been blessed to have been able to sit in and visit other circles in other kingdoms. And I've been, I've sat in circles in the Mid-Realm, and I've sat in circles in Callantyr and the Outlands. And, now here I've sat in circles out in the West and a few other places. And the thing that I'd like to stress to most everyone is that the same kind of candidates, the same kind of people are being considered and are being elevated all across the society. The different ways that the individual kingdoms might process fighters and candidates through this, that can be different, but the same type of fighters and stewards of the society are being, offered the accolade. And, what I think that also means is, there are hits and there are misses. And the systems, all the differences in the systems are generating the same kinds of hits and the same kinds of misses. Orders make mistakes, crowns make mistakes, or maybe they just weren't as strong a decision as they could have made in other areas. Whether or not your kingdom is very order centric or your kingdom is very crown centric, the good news I think for most everyone is do knightly things. Fight your butts off, help your kingdom, help your local group as best you possibly can. Look and see what the knights are doing. Pick which ones that are going to be, you don't even have to have them as mentors, but which ones are your heroes? Well, what do they do? What events do they go to? Wow, why do they keep going to that? Why do they all go to coronation? There's not even really a lot of fighting at coronation. Well, they go and do knightly things. And if you want to be a knight, go do knightly things. And it'll catch up with you regardless of what the system is. That said, my personal experiences as I've come through this was I started in Meridies, and Meridies at the time that I through most of it was probably a little, if there's a balance in sort of how the process goes, it's a little more order centric than it would be crown centric based off of my experiences in some of the other kingdoms that I've been to. Not necessarily more than some other kingdoms, but on par with them. And I don't know that it always set well with me. I do understand why it was like it was, but not long after I was elevated, I was at a circle and a candidate came up and people really had a lot of great things to say about them. Some people had they could do a little bit more, or they could, they just need more seasoning, or they need to dress better, or whatever their reasons were. And the polling came down. And in Meridies at the time, the polling was really important. The polling came through and they added up all the knights in attendance, and then they added up the knights who had sent in proxy votes, and they did some complicated math based off of, the number of what was considered active knights in the kingdom or knights in good standing. And then they did the math after the hands were yes, no, or what's that weird thing people do sometimes when they don't say yes or no?
Abstain.
Oh yeah, that's it. They cowardly abstain. So they, they went through the process and they said, "Oh, it's close. This person, Your Majesties, at this time, that Order of the Chivalry cannot recommend this person. They were close, but they just didn't make it." And I was like, "Man, that sucks. That guy's awesome. I actually wish I was as knightly as that guy." We went through the circle. We were all leaving, and the secretary of the order called us back in. It was like, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I made a numerical mistake here, and the person actually passed by one rather than failed by one. So, Your Majesties, we can recommend this person to the Order of the Chivalry." And while I was thrilled for this person, I just thought, well, this shouldn't be how knights are made. This shouldn't be how the system, that just doesn't work to my soul. Now, it actually still works in the SCA scheme of things. It absolutely works. Maybe the person didn't make it that meeting and they would have made it the next meeting. I can't say that this person's entire course of history was changed by that math. It still didn't set sits particularly well with me. And whenever I got my opportunities to start reigning, I tried to take into, I was pretty much by the book my first reign, but as the other reigns went through, I tried to assert a little more crown influence on the process, to the point of, well, I don't want to discuss anyone we wouldn't elevate. There's just no point in discussing them. Talk about only the people we would elevate. And then, well, okay, let's figure out how and who we talk to or whatever. This all came to a head when I got to Aidenvelt, and I was trying to figure out their system. And it's like, well, who's on our watch list? And they're like, well, you determine that, for the discussion. I'm like, well, okay, I can do that. But how's it typically done? I actually had seen how it's done. It's like, when I thought it was kind of novel, but it's just how they did things. So a shift circle will start a lot of times in Aidenvelt, and the crown will say, all right, I know I want to talk about this person and this person, but who do you people want to talk about? And they'll just kind of raise your hand if you've got someone you want to talk about, and they'll go around the room and they'll write down the list, make a note of every person that the order wants to talk about, and then they'll read that name of the list back to the circle and say, show me hands, and then they'll count the hands, and I go, okay, and then they sort of prioritize them based off of who the order wants to talk to or talk about at that circle. And I'm like, well, this is great. I think this is awesome. So we did that process, and I remember I was in one circle.
Sorry, just to clarify with that. So that's just whether that not they want to talk about them. That's not the actual polling for elevation, right?
That's correct. So that's the
Right.
discussion. However, the actual polling can be, okay, that discussion was great. That can be the polling. Or, well, let's just clarify. Why don't we go ahead and see a show of hands, yes or no? But there's not any, we need to wait till the next session, or we need to wait, there's not a process in place. If the crown wants to go ahead and do the polling, the order expects the crown to poll. The order actually expects the crown to assert their will on the circle's business. I guess if that's a way to say that. So it was kind of cute though. When they in one circle, they said, all right, well, great, well, all right, well, this is, I guess Her Majesty and I will, we'll go ahead and let you know what we're going to do. And they're like, you will? And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And they're like, well, you guys don't always do that, or sometimes even rarely ever. We'll go to a court and it'll happen, and we'll be like, great. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I don't know. We'll still tell you. We'll still tell you if we're going to do it. And, the biggest point that I want to take out of all this is there's lots of ways to skin this cat, and they're all kind of right. And they're all kind of weird, if you really think about it. I guess that's what I got for now.
Okay, thank you. And you do have a point that every kingdom has developed their own process, their own method, their own way of doing things. And if we dove into it deeply and had the assistance of professional demographers and sociologists, we might be able to understand how these different processes have developed and are related to all sorts of other factors. But that being said, let's move on. Your Majesty, Your Highness Rivkin, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Actually, Ontier is a lot like Aidenvelt, except I think we're even more casual. We do have a watch list and a candidate list. It changes all the time. The crown can choose to ignore it. The crown completely dictates the council. There is no vote. Whoops, my dog just moved my camera. There is no vote to get on the list. Sometimes the crown will ask for thumbs ups, or, thumb to the side is sort of abstain, or you don't really care. We don't vote. We don't vote. That is totally foreign to me. We get polled, and the crown I don't think I've ever been there where the crown hasn't told us after the poll what they're going to do. So we always know what the crown is going to do in council. That said, the poll really doesn't mean much. The crown can decide to do somebody even if the poll is negative. So like we do have lists. They're very casual. Anyone can sort of ask to add someone to a list. The candidate list is more what the crown wants on the candidate list. The watch list is a little more looser than that. You can sort of suggest people and they'll get on there. But we're super casual and super whatever the crown wants to do. That said, we have had elevations where we didn't talk about somebody. And you know, that does get a little bit political because we're supposed to at least discuss the candidate in council before they get elevated. So super casual.
Oh, and Rifkin, you guys also have like regional circles, is that right? I know you do for some of the others. Do you have for chivalry as well?
Our principalities have shiv councils, but our regions do not. All the other, well, I don't know if the mods do or not, but the Laurels and the Pelicans definitely have regional councils. We're a huge kingdom. Our population is enormous. I think that it's sort of a detriment for the shiv that we don't do regional outside of the principalities, because we never have the kind of backing on a candidate that the principalities do. They all, you know, because they get together in their own little meeting and all decide that this person should go to kingdom. But besides that, no.
But hey, you're about to be queen, so you can change that.
For 6 months.
For 6 months, and then deals off. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of touch on something that has been mentioned a couple of times regarding polling versus voting. Kapora says that the crown must take counsel from the order. It does not say that the crown has to do a polling. You just have to take counsel. And I know some kingdoms through customs and whatnot have kind of evolved to a point where there is, you know, expected polling. And then that's, again, we're talking about the differences in the process and everything. But yeah, let's certainly emphasize that it is a polling, it is not a voting, and the crown absolutely makes the decision that they feel is in the best interest of the candidate and the order. But it's, yeah, it doesn't have to be a polling, it just has to be counsel. And quite frankly, sometimes that counsel is you coming into to a shiv circle and saying, we intend to knight this person. You know, the chivalry might not like it, and it can be kind of a shitty thing to do, but that is counsel. I mean, even if you're telling the order, and that does not happen very much. Let me be clear on that. So I'm not suggesting that that's a way we should operate.
And let's also stress, Sean, that when it has happened, it almost always has ended poorly for everyone.
Yeah.
So if you're a young hot stick out there and you're thinking to yourself, you know, well, what I'm hearing is that I can win crown and then pretty much do what I want because technically I have consulted the order. Look, I'm going to be crude for just a second. This is a common statement within the society in certain circles that, you know, you're king for 6 months and you're building a sandwich. That sandwich is made of shit. And if you keep spreading that around through the course of your reign, at the end of that reign, you're going to have to eat that sandwich. So how big of a sandwich do you want? And what this means is, you know, if you're doing crappy things, you're going to have a crappy after life when it comes to coming down from the throne. So be super careful about, you know, I'm just going to consult the order and then do what I want.
Yep.
It ends poorly for everybody. The candidates, there's so few candidates who've actually gone through that are still in the essay like that. You're not doing them a ton of favors here.
Yeah, absolutely. When I had heard it, the phrase that I'd heard was from my friends in Callantyre. It said, at the end of your reign, you will have a shit sandwich. Your job is to make sure it's not a shit picnic. Yeah. So yeah, you can do that, but it's a polling. It's not a vote. You have to take counsel.
I just want to add something to that, in that the corpora does, I agree, corpora does say that the crown has to consult, the order has to advise. The form that consultation takes is governed largely by kingdom tradition. And as all of us here know, and many people listening understand, that changing a law is one thing, but trying to change a tradition can be much more difficult and fraught. And because people may not understand the law, but they understand their traditions. And so that when yes, and I agree with the it's been my experience that people have been elevated to any order over the objections of the order. It has not gone well for anyone. It's not, and it's a disservice to the person being elevated to. So I'd like to throw it to Ulrich.
Thanks. That's a lot to follow. So in Meridiers, currently, in this, we developed this way for a lot of reasons, but this is the way it is now. A lot of it is traditions that have been codified in our charter, and a little bit in our law, because anytime you have a rule, there's a person or a situation that caused that rule to come to be, our guideline, or whatever the case may be. But we have 2 required meetings by our charter that happen every reign. We can certainly have more, and a lot of times after events we'll have a little gathering and talk. But we can have other meetings. This have to be called on that. When we have that meeting, there's an agenda. To get on the agenda, you just have to let the secretary know 2 weeks ahead of time. This sounds really, really complex, but it's actually not so much. To get on the agenda is really just a matter of Bob moved from Kaid over to Meridiers, and now I'm like, hey, let's talk about Bob, and he's on the agenda. But it has to go out 2 weeks ahead of time so everyone knows. We only do business at meetings. And all of our meetings are usually at events, except for right now during the pandemic where we have virtual stuff still. But we don't really have a watch list. We've started doing something really neat in lieu of a watch list. Knights that are in tournaments, after the tournament is over, when they go home, they write a post up and they talk about all the unbelts and how they did at the tournament. So you get a running go on that in lieu of a watch list. Our candidate list, like I said, is just a matter of being put on the agenda. We have official discussions and unofficial discussions and pollings as far as the order goes. So generally an unofficial discussion happens at the end of a meeting where I go, hey, I'm thinking about putting Bob on the discussion list for next time. You guys just give me your opinion on that, or we'll have a little quick talk. Then the next meeting comes up, Bob's on the agenda. There's one official discussion, and then he has to be there for a second official discussion and or polling. The second official discussion at the next meeting can be as simple as, okay, well, we talked about Bob last time, everything went fantastic. Can we move that to a polling? And then we have the polling, and we still have that percentage number that you talked about earlier, Ailgheanan. That's still something here. It's a 2/3 majority. We did not allow proxies or unofficial no votes, essentially, or no pollings, essentially. But so we still have that. It's 2/3, and it goes straight to the crown. If they have 2/3, then we recommend them. If they don't have 2/3, then we don't recommend them. But it's just a recommendation. Let's be clear about that. It's just a recommendation. I continue. The order can say, we don't recommend this person, and the crown can go, thank you for your consultation. We will be elevating this person this evening. That's completely on them. But one of the things that has changed here recently is we do have a law that a kingdom law that the crown must consult the order, and then consultation has been defined as they have to go, basically they have to go on the agenda, be polled on. And like I said before, if there's a rule, there's reason.
So just let me ask you a question,
Sure.
Ulrich.
Sure.
So we hear a lot of times about, that it's the crown's responsibility to uphold the laws and the traditions of a kingdom.
Right.
And tradition is pretty freaking arbitrary.
Yes.
So laws are definitely an easier thing to uphold than tradition, because I know all of us have been in the SCA for a while, and we've all seen that if you can do it a couple of times, it starts to become a tradition.
Right.
But if you're taking a grievance and it kind of goes up the SCA food chain through your kingdom, and if it gets up to society, it is really, really hard to convince people who don't live where you live that someone is going against tradition. So if it's important to you folks out there in their kingdoms that things get done a certain way, figure out a way to make it a law, or you should expect that someone else is going to step on it and say, new tradition.
So yes, certainly laws are much more difficult to circumvent. Even if, you know, I don't know if every Shiv order does. Our Shiv order certainly has a charter, a list of rules, a list of guidelines for us to follow. That the charter governs how the chivalry themselves conduct business. It does not govern what the crown does. But if you can show that, if you have that codified and you can show that, then your argument will have more substance. But in the end, it's going to come down to law, kingdom law, and corpora. Anytime you have a grievance of that nature.
And just to clarify, not every kingdom has a charter that defines how their orders work. And I would say it's, I mean, just off the top of my head, I'd say it's probably more like a 50-50 thing. There's plenty of kingdoms that don't. Could be,
Yeah, and
it's the exception rather than the rule.
Just to add to that, I agree, not every kingdom has, their orders don't always have a charter. And Ailgheanan, you were describing crown centric versus order centric kingdoms, and the charter and how the charter, I know in the middle, it's more, well, the purpose of the meeting is to advise, it's to share information among the order, but also primarily to advise the crown. So the crown can conduct the meetings of the order and the polling in whatever fashion they choose. If they prefer to do it all in meetings, although there's a tradition of polling now, there's no law that says they have to do a written polling, and some have preferred not to. But another observation that I have not ever heard them the meetings of the order referred to as a council or a circle in the middle. And it sounds like councils are an established thing, or the circle is another word for meeting. It's just a semantic difference, I think, and those are interesting. There are process differences, but also terminology and semantic differences. So who would like to comment next?
I can jump in here. I mean, based on
Okay.
that, yeah, the Shiv Council or the Shiv Circle, I mean, we usually refer to it as a circle. I mean, yeah, you're right. It is kind of arbitrary and semantic discussion, you know, about what it's called, and you know, what constitutes a circle or what constitutes, you know, council. I know several of the kingdoms we're talking about are much more strict on, you know, how many people you have to take counsel from in order for it to be considered counsel. I know here in Artemisia, we are very casual in our process, and a lot of that has to do with, you know, we have a smaller population base. I would suspect that Eldamir is in a similar situation, you know, where, you know, with having a smaller population base as well. I know for us, you know, we generally don't have more than, you know, 5 people who at any given time are up for discussion with our orders, and we all generally know who those people are, you know. And every once in a while we get an outlier where a crown comes in and says that they want to elevate somebody, and yeah, that absolutely happens. And you know, as a royalist, I will defend to the death, you know, the right of the crown to do that. But as Ailgheanan had pointed out earlier, often does not go well for the candidate or for the order. But our process is very, very casual. You know, in our last reign, you know, the one night that we had made, you know, we had, you know, I don't know that we actually did an official polling, but it was very much, you know, we asked around and like, anybody got a problem with us doing this? And all the feedback we got on that was positive. And so we just kind of rolled with that. And, you know, so that was my point earlier, that it doesn't have to be a polling. It just has to be council. And, you know, to Valrik's point, you know, you get some of these people that are kind of, you know, you just hadn't noticed. And then when their name gets brought up, you're like, oh yeah, we should totally do that. You know, that's council. And for us, it is very casual, like that. Yeah, I know a lot of other kingdoms, it's not.
If I could sort of jump in, I know
Yeah.
we've talked about charters, because I know Kaid has a charter. The Shiv of Kaid have a charter. And even though, and I believe the charter is 2/3 and there's a lot of things spelled out, but once again, it comes down to, it is, even though we vote or there's a poll, it's still an advice or a positive affirmation from the council to the current crown that we think this candidate is worthy to join our order. And the crown can still say no or yes. And really, like I said, I know, like a lot of the charter stuff, I believe from memory was brought in being because of, you know, problems in the past, you know, and that's sort of been touched on, but, you know, just that having a crown wanting to make taking a candidate, which has been discussed, who the majority of Shiv was opposed to. And that's what sort of was engendered some of the chartering. Though, I mean, in our system, as much as we're more, say, council driven, I mean, it still defaults to the crown can make that decision, yes or no, and push against the council. But this goes to what Alan and Sean have talked on, that tends to not work out the best for people. Or as Alan pointed out, they tend to drop away, which I've seen.
Just one comment here. We have all used the terms council and council. And I want to clarify the difference for anyone who's listening between counsel, COUNSEL, the advice given to someone is how you counsel them, versus counsel, COUNCIL, which is a group of people that like an order council. An order council, COUNCIL, can counsel, COUNSEL, the crown. And just to clarify that, because using homophones in the same sentence can be quite confusing to people who are listening. So who would like to add a comment?
I think Rifkin's good to go, Her Highness.
Yes.
I was just gonna answer the question. The viewer question was, has pandemic caused a change in the number of deserving candidates? Why or why not? And I was just gonna say, in Ontario, we have not had a Knights Council in 2 years. We've done a little teeny bit of talking on our Facebook group. And for the most part, the people that were on the list before are still on the list. But I think what's really going to happen is, you know, we haven't had a lot of fighting events yet either, but hopefully that's going to change come January and we'll have our big Ursumus tournament again. And then after that, you know, the list will probably get maybe, you know, tanked and then restarted. So I think, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, whether you're on a list or whether you could be on a list, like, now is the time to you know, go to tournaments and act knightly and do the knightly things and put on your good armor that you made over the pandemic, and just become somebody that people look at and go, why aren't we talking about that guy?
So one of the things I can say that we've had, one of the advantages of having an online forum, and the online forum is password protected, and there's one for each order, and you can go in and you can add your comments. You can add comments. The advocate, and again, there's another case of homophones. An advocate, sometimes I've heard the word sponsor, is somebody who is they are not advocating, noun, as in not trying to push a candidate, but they are an advocate for the candidate, as in they are the person, the member of the order who is most knowledgeable about what that candidate is doing, what their level is, what their situation is, and what their, where they are, and can convey that information to the rest of the order. So there's a difference between advocate, noun, advocate, verb, and that's an important one, because otherwise it's not a form of lobbying. People often, members of the order will often, and this is another difference between kingdoms, will often sometimes need to bring up their own dependents, squires, and so forth, and sometimes are expected to refrain from doing that. And that's another cultural difference between kingdoms as well that we might address.
Yeah, actually, I was going to jump in with that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that that I definitely wanted to bring up in this discussion, because in Artemisia, we tend to not bring up our own students. I know I prefer to allow my students to gain their own renown and to be brought up by the order. But I know in Meridier's, this is why I wanted to have Ulrich touch on this a little bit. It is very much the tradition that the knight themselves, if somebody's squired to that knight, that the knight themselves has to bring them before the order. Ulrich, would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's actually really kind of taboo here to not, for someone else to bring up your squire or the person that you're supposed to be sponsoring. And that usually only happens if you're failing in some way to bring up someone who's really, really there. I've only seen that happen a couple of times. But generally speaking here, what we do is, and it's hard to speak for everyone, but the process that usually works is we're going to events. Bob, who's moved here from Kaid, is doing great. We're people are noticing him. His prowess is great. His kit's great. His PLQs are awesome. I'm a sponsor, and then Ailgheanan will go, "Hey Ulrich, when are you going to bring up Bob? Because I just lost to him, and and I want to see him do well." And then usually for me, I need
This story was made up.
No, yeah, clearly.
Never lost to that squire.
I have video. But anyway, so usually I have, when 2 or 3 people come to you, or at the end of a night's meeting, someone, or a SHID meeting, someone will go, "Hey, Ulrich, when are we talking about Bob?" And that'll put me, or put that candidate sponsor into the mindset of whether or not they should bring that up. And then if they don't, usually there's another conversation that happens. If 3 or 4 people come to me and I'm not bringing up Bob for some reason, then the question becomes, why are you not bringing up Bob? And then that develops into another question, and we try to help Bob out if there's an issue there. But absolutely, a lot of times I'll hear, when people ask a candidate, and we covered this on the last show, the things not to say, which is, don't go to Bob and say, "Dude, I saw you beat Ailgheanan in that tournament. Why aren't you a knight?" Go talk to Bob's knight or sponsor and ask them that, and let them deal with that situation. Because Bob doesn't know. Bob's just trying to be the best person he can, do knightly things, and do the right thing. So that's the process here. And I think that kind of came on the line of along the lines of no one knows that person better than the person, you may have a blind spot for them and you may be a little bit harder on them, but when you bring that person up, you want them to be highly supported by the order. So if you're a little tougher on your own people, we're usually okay with that. And I know we've had several conversations, and Duke Eliahu commented on it, the difference between an advocate and advocating. And we are not talking about, I'm not pushing Bob and saying, you guys have got to knight Bob. How that conversation goes, if we're all sitting in a circle or a council, and I say, all right, so I'm sponsoring Bob. Bob's been doing great. He's doing these things. What do you guys think? What is your counsel to me and the crown on Bob? What can I help him work on? Let me know your feelings. And then the order generally tells me in that meeting and the crown at the same time, so that we can get Bob across the line at some point.
It certainly takes me back, to the Meridian circles where, and when I first went to a circle that wasn't in Meridies and other people brought up a candidate rather than the actual quote unquote circle sponsor or their knight, that was really weird to me, but it made sense. And again, it's one of those things where both systems work, but I'm always reminded in the Meridian circles forever, and I'm sure it was this way in Glenaubin for a while. If you were a squire to Duke Steppenwolf and he brought you up, he was like the absolute best knight / worst sponsor you could ever have, because he certainly prepared a number of squires to become knights, but when he came time to talk about him, I mean, he was just terrible. I mean, he's like, I feel like I got to bring this guy up, but I don't know why. He really can't fight that well. He doesn't do all that much. I used to just laugh and laugh because, like, man, you can't have a worst person try to sponsor you. But, I think we all saw through the fact that he held his squires to a really super high standard. He also was embarrassed to have to try to bring them up and sing their praises. So he normally kind of tried to bring everything back down. But, you understand these things. You typically don't bring someone, even though there are exceptions, but you typically wouldn't bring someone to the circle if you hadn't got some feedback from other people saying it was time.
Valrik.
Sure. At least in Caid, what I've experienced, and this is that the sponsor, the knight to a squire, they almost always bring them up as a possible, to move from our watch list. They'll say, hey, I think Bob's getting beat up a bit, but I think he should be elevated to the candidates list. It does happen that, I will say, hey, we should talk about this guy. I know he's squire to somebody else. And I've seen where the knight to a squire would be like, no, Bob's not ready. Leave him where he is. Even though, I could sing this Bob guy, this metaphorical guy praises. But usually with us, it is the sponsor, I'll use that term, who's pushes people, listen, I think he's ready and I want your counsel. I think we should move him up. And then when we move somebody up from the watch the candidate, that's when, sort of the microscope comes out, or, whatever, where people start looking at him, really kind of grinding what's his skills like, his prowess, is this, is that, and all that other kind of stuff. But it's usually, if a lot of us will think that, well, if his sponsor's not saying anything, then leave him where he is. That's how sort of the tradition that we have, or I'll ask a sponsor, be like, why haven't, what's going on with this guy? And he's like, nah, he's got X, he's got this going on in his life. He's not quite there. I'm like, all right. Rarely do you see someone like me as an outsider saying, hey, I think this guy's squire should be elevated to the candidates list. Happens.
Yeah, if I can,
infrequent.
If I can step in here, I think that if I see a person, a squire, say, who I think is ready, I will go to the candidate, to the knight, and talk to them about what's going on and where they are and what their status is. And also it relates to a question that we'll ask sometimes oftentimes in the meeting: what can we do to help this person become ready? because it can sound, listening to the processes and the sequence of events and all the hoops, that the order is exclusive, but the real intent of every order is to be inclusive, is to find ways to help people join, to help people be brought into the order, to help them be elevated. So that's the question I routinely hear when someone's being discussed and they're not quite ready. Okay, who's going to help them? Who is in the best position to help them with this? How can we help? What can we do to support their growth and their progress? It's not a good idea for someone to be discussed in a meeting, a circle, and then all the knights go out of the meeting, if the meeting's happening at an event, where it usually does for us, and then go start talking to the person, because that's like really obvious. But it's important to figure out, what can we do? How can we help? And I think that I don't want that point to get missed or overlooked, that's really a significant thing that people ask. Sean.
Yeah, I just think that's a really great point. I mean, there's a lot of people who I think, outside the circle will think that we're always looking for reasons to keep somebody out of the circle, and that is just not the case. I have believed for a long time that I truly believe that anybody who decides to engage in our sport, anybody is capable of joining this order, but at the same time, not everybody will, right? I mean, it is an elite order, and should be, but for those people that want to put the work into it, I think we have an obligation as an order to do what we can to assist them, to try to help them gain that accolade and to be part of that, if they're willing to put in the effort. Over the years, as standards have changed, and we hear a lot about raising the bar and that sort of stuff. The skill level that it takes to be knighted now is and should be higher than it was when I got knighted 30 years ago. But the thing that is consistent is the level of effort that it takes, because we're training people better now. I mean, Coach's Corner and all. I mean, just as a society, we are training our sport better, and we are teaching people better. But you put in the same amount of work now that it took to get knighted in the 70s and the 80s, and we are we as an order are generally going to bend over backwards for the people that are going to put out that effort, because we want people that are putting out that effort, and we want them in the order. We're trying to be more inclusive and less exclusive, for sure.
Valrik.
So yeah, I mean, kind of dovetailing off that to a degree, and this is a question that's come up amongst a lot of fighters that I've talked to. So how do you if somebody is a war fighter, how do you evaluate, and of course define that, how do you evaluate that? Can that impede them trying to become a knight? Can it, how do you guys different think about that? And, defining that, because I sort of came up as a war fighter. I wasn't squired. I fought wars. I got lucky, and I kind of rolled really good dice at a couple of Estrella wars, and I was in command of stuff. And so I had a couple good moments, which kind of brought me to attention. But I realized that I needed to get my one-on-one skills up, because though I could do some good things on the battlefield, one-on-one, I was still average. And so I pushed myself to get better. But I've had a lot of people bring this up, because, they'll say, Bob has been fighting at 20 wars. He's led a unit, some of them will be like, I've won this war and I won that war. And I'm like, well, let's go slow there. But that's definitely exists. I want to see what other people's views on that. How do you make that determination and evaluation?
Ailgheanan.
Sure. Well, we touched on this on the first part of this, stream where we talked about sort of what people's individual thoughts were about, um, how they evaluated candidates. But it's good to circle back to it because I think, it also kind of goes back to, well, what do different kingdoms think about such a thing? Because while we definitely have individual thoughts on whether or not a person can be a war knight, or they can be a, multiple weapon knight or whatever, it's we have, um, the reality is that in some kingdoms you can't really be a war knight, and in some kingdoms you absolutely can. Um, and in some kingdoms it's harder, and in some kingdoms it's easier. I know that, from my personal standpoint, absolutely a person can excel at war and be able to use war as a means to show their prowess. Um, and that will raise them up if they're not as strong in some of the more individual prowess things, but they can't completely suck. They still need to be competitive, and they still need to be able to hold their own. It's just if they're not as strong in one thing, but they're absolutely great at the weapons of war and leading troops and helping kingdoms, be able to field larger armies and support their kingdom that way, then you can absolutely, I think, that is a path for some people out there. But it is really specific as to what kingdom you're in, how well that's going to work.
Well, and I have a comment too, and again, this is something we touched on in the episode about our individual method for evaluating candidates, that inevitably in war there will come a point where fighting will break down, and individual combat skills will be needed, and the person to be considered for the chivalry, I think, has to be able to fight like a knight individually. But if all a person does is fight individually, then they're not also learning the set of skills, related but different set of skills they need for melee and war, and they're not providing leadership and service. So I think that both are necessary, and I have counseled candidates and counseled my fellow knights on the need to do this. I've said if I did it just for fun, I'd just fight single combat, but a knight has a duty to fight for and with their kingdom, and so I do that and have pushed myself to get good at doing that. I know knights who, if it was just for fun, they would just fight in melee and war, but they push themselves to be good at individual combat because that's also expected of a knight. So that's my answer on that. So, Sean?
Yeah, I know. The East Kingdom is very melee centric in this regard. The East Kingdom and to a lesser degree, I think the Mid Realm, y'all have a very deep focus on Pennsic, and at Pennsic War, you have the Unbelted Champions battle, and in the East Kingdom, it is virtually impossible to get knighted if you have not been on the Unbelted Champions team. You could be the greatest tourney fighter, okay, well, if you're the greatest tourney fighter in the East as an unbelted fighter, you're probably going to get recognized for that, but by and large, in the mean, it is virtually impossible to get knighted in the East Kingdom without being on the East Kingdom Unbelted Champions team. And that again kind of goes back to that process, customs and traditions and whatnot. I mean, if you've been invited to fight on the Unbelted Champions team in the East, you're gonna have to have a really good reason for why you're not going to be participating in that and supporting the crown in that way. I mean, because it is a great honor. And I know everybody's got the reasons for why they do or don't do tournaments and why they do or don't do melee. But yeah, that's the thing for them. So you got to be part of that.
And just to quickly add, and that's great about the East. I think that's pretty awesome. And they're they're both the middle and the East's unbelt champions have always really impressed me. But even in kingdoms that are really, really war centric and have a number of melee events or a number of, war type of things that they can do per year, that number is still like 4 or 5, whereas there are dozens and dozens of tournaments. So it's a tougher path for sure. But I wouldn't want people to be discouraged if that's the path you're on. Keep doing it. You might have to work harder, and it may take longer, because at 4 or 5 events a year, people seeing your prowess versus someone being able to go and win a tournament or do very well in a tournament. The spotlight is on them. I mean, that's just the way it is. But keep to your path and broaden what you're doing as best you can. And if that's your path, great. And I love how His Grace Eliahu says, at some point in a war, it's very likely that it's going to break down and your individual prowess is going to need to show up. I know personally, for my sake, that if I'm leading a group and I see a couple of people running up behind me, and I come in and I point at someone and I say, handle that, they're handling that with prowess, and it's good. It's a fun system that we have, that you can both be good at tourney, and you can also go do wars. But oftentimes those skills translate, go back and forth.
I want to dovetail with what you said. You made a really pertinent point. When you can say, handle that to somebody.
Yeah.
And then you as the commander do not have to worry about it being handled.
No, I can turn my back.
That's a definition of someone's got their prowess is definitely there. When you can say, because I know there's some people who are war fighters, but if you issued a command to them, say, go handle those 2 guys running on our backfield, you probably want to double back around and check, because you're like, well, I know he can do this, but I don't know, maybe he's going to take, if it's a 2-on-1 thing, I would have, that might be, that's just a good, I don't know. I just kind of wanted to clarify. That's a good way to sort of judge, do they have the knightly martial qualities to handle something small like that needs to be handled on a battlefield? And maybe that answers my question. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a listener question. Unless somebody else wants to comment on that. We have a listener question. What good and bad things would happen if the candidate knew the specific qualities that the majority of people thought they needed to improve on to become a knight? Do you believe the knight of a squire should tell them why or why not? Well, it's a lot is how it's done. Because certainly a knight should counsel their squire and saying, here are things to look on, to work on. Even a knight who's they're not squired to, or they're not a student of, can say, hey, I've noticed something, here's what I think. But it's always should be framed, here's what I, as an individual knight, think you should work on. Not, hey, the order is saying this about you. For 2 reasons. One, that's breaking the confidentiality of the order, of the circle, and so on. And we haven't really talked about expectations of confidentiality in order deliberations. I think that's pretty universal, but you can all can comment on that. But in addition, it won't be received as advice and as help. It will be received in a negative way. And I know this from personal experience, because when I was an unbelt and I was improving and I was enjoying myself and enjoying fighting and learning and getting better, a knight came to me and said, hey, you should know the order's talking about you and you're doing great, so keep doing it. And that really put me off track, because it made me conscious of being watched, not of what I was doing, but of what I was being watched as doing. And so advice should certainly be given to squires and students and aspirants to the orders, but it should be given on a personal basis, not as any one individual representing themselves as stating the will or the opinion of the order or observations of the order. And that's my answer to it. Does anyone else have a comment?
Yeah, the coming out of the meeting and going up to someone and saying, hey, we've been chatting about you and this needs, this is something you need to work on. That's even worse than the, aren't you a knight question. Whew. That's rough. I've seen it happen though, unfortunately. But to answer the question itself, one of the reasons our process works the way it does here in Meridies is if the order has advice, or my brothers and sisters have advice for my squire or the person I'm sponsoring, then it's not out of the norm for me to go over and work directly with my squire or someone I'm sponsoring on those things that they are deficient in, because that's my job anyway. So it becomes a matter of, it kind of helps our order secrecy as it is, our order confidentiality. I hate the word secrecy in that situation, but our order confidentiality, to deal with that in that way. And it's also not uncommon for me to go, I don't have anything, if I have a squire that's 6'5", it's really difficult for me to teach them how to fight tall, but it's not difficult at all for me to say, hey, come over here and fight my friend Ailgheanan or my friend Caspar, who's tall and knows how to teach you, how to deal with those situations, because without saying, hey, the order said that you're not fighting tall and it's impeding your fighting ability, and I need you to do that. Right? So being subtle is not something that we're normally good at, but it's a good situation, something that we need to do in those situations. And that's how you deal with that. Don't ever walk up to someone and say, hey, the order's watching you and this is what you need to work on. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Hey, before we jump to Sean answering, or Sean just saying something, I want to add to the order confidentiality thing. It is a big deal. Every order I've ever, had an opportunity to sit in or be a part of has mentioned it. I love the fact one of the commenters said that in the outlines, they start every circle talking about the importance of the confidentiality and that it is the crown's right to be able to say what gets said based on that meaning. I think that's awesome. And it is absolutely super important. The thing to remember is that what is confidentiality seems to be not a universal understanding. And I tell new knights and people who are in their vigils, my bit of advice is, and you can certainly do whatever you want, but you shouldn't say anything in that circle you don't expect that candidate to hear, even with the point of, and Ailgheanan said this, having had that confidentiality breached, what I thought was confidentiality, and have it come back and bite me as it has bit me before, I've just tried to live with, okay, I will tell you what I would tell the circle. And if it's good, good. If it's bad, bad. But the point is, as Sean and Eliahu and others have pointed out, we're not trying to be gatekeepers. We're trying to increase the size of our fence to have more knights in it. So it's, what can I do to help you become a knight? And sometimes that means telling you shit you don't want to hear. But don't say, I tell people all the time, don't say anything, even an email. I love the fact that you guys, that some of these folks have a really cool online system to do polling and to do, offer counsel to the crown. But I just don't, I don't believe that the rest of the world has the same understanding of confidentiality that I think I do. So you should expect that your stuff's going to get out there.
I just kind of want to echo that because, but I kind of want to take it from a different perspective, is that anytime I say anything in counsel, it is because I want someone to succeed. And I want to point out the things that I think they need to work on. And a lot of times that's taken as negative, like I have a beef with somebody or I don't like them. And that's never the case. Never, ever, ever the case. So when somebody breaks counsel and tells you something that somebody said about you, try to take it in a way where that person actually wants to see you succeed, and that is something that they think that if you worked on, you would succeed, and don't take it negatively, because it's going to happen. I mean, Alan, he's 100% correct. Stuff doesn't stay in council. It should, and it doesn't. So I just think that's really important to sort of emphasize, is that even the negative stuff is really about getting you to succeed, and it's not about trying to tear you down or that somebody doesn't like you.
Yeah, and you know, I'm going to echo a lot of these thoughts too. You know, we've often had this idea that, you know, when a candidate finds out that they're being discussed and some form on some level, you know, there's occasionally this thing where, oh, they know we're talking about them. Somebody must have broken circle. Like, how about these guys are just not that dumb, and we're not that subtle. You know, because we've all seen it. You know, like I said, you get out of circle and you have 5 nights to go rushing over to this candidate and tell them all what they want. You know, I want you to see, I want to see you do this or that and the other. You know, I mean, as candidates start, you know, climbing up the ladder, as it were, you know when you're being talked about, and you don't have to have somebody break circle, you know, to do that. And as far as confidentiality goes, you know, I think there are, you know, I mean, to Rifkin's point, you know, there are things that come up in circle that the candidate needs to know is you know, a problem or something that they need to work on. And if we are not going to, if you know, we can't just sit in the circle and say, you know, that they've got this problem. Okay, well, if you think they have this problem, what are you willing to do about it? You know, if you think that they have a fighting specific thing that you want them to work on, I know personally, I always offer, it's like, if it's a technique specific thing, I always make myself available to try to help them as best I can to fix that technique specific thing. But if there's a problem, they need to know that there's a problem. And so the confidentiality on that, you know, only works to a certain degree. You know, we're like, and my only issue is, like, they need to know about these things. They just don't need to know who said what about who. You know, I don't need to go to them and say, well, Al-Anon says that you got to work on this part of your fight, or Al-Anon says you got to autocrat more events, or Ulrich says you got to, you know, take an office. You know, it's like, they don't need to know who said what about whom, but there are definitely parts that if we are going to, you know, do our best to help these people get into the order, there are things they need to know. They just don't need to know who it came from.
I have a comment about that if there are 2 virtues that of the chivalric virtues I'll mention here. The first is veritas, or truthfulness, honesty, and the second is humility. And they're both important to gaining prowess, which is another virtue. That, so if somebody offers helpful, what's commonly referred to as constructive criticism to someone, it should be offered honestly, but from them personally, not attributed to someone else, but from them personally. And the person should, who's an aspirant to the order, or just a person who wants to grow and improve as a person, should listen to it, accepting it as honest, helpful, constructive criticism with humility. And humility is not false modesty, but is an honest appraisal, self-appraisal of your own strengths and weaknesses. And so both veritas and humilitas are necessary to gaining prowess. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about. And so I think it's time for final comments from anyone who has them to offer.
Can I have one anecdote? Just about before we finish the topic. I remember young and coming up, and I know when people were talking about us, is when someone asks you to come play a game of chess at a tourney. It doesn't happen very much anymore, but I vividly remember that happening and people talking about it. So I don't know. I just thought I'd throw it out there. Maybe we should play more chess at tourneys, but I don't know.
That's hilarious. And how are you at dance?
Not that. It was chess. back, this was, late 90s. This, I don't know, the dance thing. Yeah, I didn't dance. I made it without dancing somehow. Anyways, I don't want to steal, I don't know, anyways, please continue. I just want to add that in.
Other final comments?
I'll go real quickly. I just want to say these are to me very fascinating sessions that we've had. I'm really glad that we've had a lot of active participation in the comments with the questions, and such a robust discussion with the coaches and our guest. It's just endlessly fascinating, the differences between kingdoms, and the thing is that you can see how different they are and yet so similar, and it's just it's one of the cool magical things about the Society for Creative Anachronism that from the west to the east and to Drachenwald and Loch and all points in between, all our varied differences kind of still creates this large, cool, shared collective thing. And our circles, our orders, especially our peerage orders, are one of the things that makes us all very similar, even with the different ways that we get to them. When I meet a knight, and that knight is from Drachenwald, I don't think to myself, well, I wonder what they're deficient in because they don't have the opportunity to hang out with us all the time. I think, hello, brother, sister knight. It is a pleasure to meet you, and I want to know more about you. And that's the same with every member of these orders that I meet from all over the SCA. I have something shared and in common with them. Even if the process to how they got there was different than mine, we still have this sort of shared thing. And I think that it's still really cool that people aspire to these orders. And we're very grateful for everyone to continue to aspire to them. And if I can be a little cliche about it, the fact that there are people aspiring to be knights and knights who are aspiring to be good knights, that's a constant source of inspiration for me. So thank you, everyone.
Sean?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the great things about the society is the interkingdom anthropology. Every kingdom has its own kind of flavor, and they all have their own ways of getting to essentially the same thing. And to echo, Elanon's point earlier in the show, the cream rises to the top, right? I mean, regardless of what the mechanisms are and what the process is across kingdoms. Again, as I was saying earlier, the folks that are putting in the effort are the folks that are going to be recognized. And it doesn't matter what the system is within your kingdom. If you were excelling in prowess and you were excelling in your franchise, you are going to be recognized because those things will become self-evident and they will become undeniable. And then whatever the process happens to be, you will make it through that process, again, because we want you to be successful.
Rauokinn, something?
Sure. I just wanted to emphasize communication, because I know that a lot of times the process can seem arbitrary to people outside of it. And while there is a lot of subjective judgment or decisions, I guess, it isn't arbitrary. And I think if you have questions about it, about procedurally, like what's happening or how it happens, you should just ask, like, because we're talking about it here, but you just ask somebody. They're not going to tell you who they're talking about, but they'll let you know how it works. It's not a secret. And we want you to succeed. We want more people to make a richer Knights Council.
And thank you, Ulrich, the man with the perfect Thanksgiving themed T-shirt.
God is my witness. I thought turkeys could fly.
Yep.
So I'm going to go a little off field here for a second. So if you're an up and coming or someone on the path, and you have to move to a new kingdom and you're worried about starting over, remember that the systems that we're using aren't really that different. We talked about a lot of different things here, but they're not really that different. And talking to a local knight when you get there will help you understand what their system is and how to live within it. But really don't worry about that. Just be yourself and do what you were doing before, and try to learn. The SCA is smaller, and by smaller, what I mean is it's much easier for me to reach out to my friend Sean from Majesty Sean from Artemisia and say, hey, I've got a guy who just moved out there. Look for this guy. The starting over concept that this came from on a personal message to me during the show. The starting over concept is really kind of gone. You may have to step back a little bit and learn where you are, but you're not starting over. And I guarantee you that wherever you're going, if you're doing things the way they're supposed to be done, and you're trying and doing this game with love and passion, then people will love you and want you to be here in that circle with them out in whatever kingdom that's going to be. So, just because you're comfortable one place and you have to go somewhere else, be comfortable there too.
Thank you. Anything else? Well, I want to mention that, first of all, I want to thank everybody and thank everybody for listening, and also mention that next week, the subject of the episode is developing the competitive mindset. And that should be very interesting. Anything else, Tristan?
Let's see here. Switch. No, I think we're good. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and being on our show. The coaches are our special guests. It's great to have you here, and thank everybody for showing up and listening, and hope you got a lot out of this. And we will be putting the recording of this show up on the YouTube channel as usual. Anybody else? Last comment?
Hey, thank you very much for inviting me. I've been watching you guys since this pandemic thing started, and I really appreciate it. This has had a lot of good commentary. A lot of people have there's some really good content, anthropology, all the stuff that's been talked about. Keep doing this. Don't let this drop off as we get back to normal playing. This is a good thing. Please keep.
Yeah, we love it too.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for joining us, Valrik. I really appreciate you being here.
All right.
I think that's it. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night, everybody.
Good night.
night.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.